For today's video, we're going to talk all about HIIT training, high intensity interval training. I recently put out a little series on my Instagram that went over all the benefits of HIIT training and what HIIT training is. A lot of my followers know me from CrossFit because I was a CrossFit coach for quite a while and competed in CrossFit. And so a lot of folks know me as a CrossFit guy. And so they relate me to high intensity. But as you know, if you've been following my channel for a while, I am not necessarily about that life and not all about doing high intensity every single day, and especially such high impact movements that are involved in CrossFit. However, I do think HIIT training is great and HIIT training has its place. So I want to break down and talk about what is HIIT training. Okay. HIIT training is high intensity interval training. So number one, it's high intensity. What does that mean? What does high intensity constitute? And it's interval training. So for me, when you talk about high intensity, I tend to relate that to a couple things. Power output, heart rate zones, or FTP, if you're familiar with that, functional threshold power, which is measured usually on a bike. Cyclists use FTP for measuring certain zones and thresholds of their all-out power and output based on a 1-hour test. So when we talk about high intensity, to me, it's either high FTP zone, either like zone 6 as an example, FTP. For heart rate, a zone 5, or for output, it's going to be a high percentage of your output. So to me, high intensity, when you look at it, is usually going to be a shorter interval, right? I mean, arguably anywhere from 10 seconds up to, I like 3 minutes, but I could give it some leeway and say maybe even a 5-minute interval. But I think 5 minutes is even starting to get a little bit, I could call 5 minutes high intensity because, you know, if somebody runs a 6-minute mile, right, that's a pretty strong mile. So, you know, and that's a pretty strong output for that 6 minutes. So I'll give 6 minutes the benefit of the doubt because of that 6-minute mile thing. But I really wouldn't want the intervals to go too much over that because then I think you're falling into some different zones. There's not enough power output there. You're going to get to that 90% heart rate plus. But anyways, so really the main thing is that it's high intensity, that it's true high intensity. It's not really paced. So in CrossFit workouts, like a lot of people just relate CrossFit to HIIT or high intensity interval training. And really a lot of times CrossFit in how they do it is not, right? Like for example, a 20-minute AMRAP, which is 20 minutes of continuous work, would not be HIIT training. It's not high intensity interval training. It might be high intensity for the whole 20 minutes, but you have to pace it in order to survive for that 20 minutes. So although it's quote unquote high intensity, it's kind of a longer duration high intensity, right? So that would be more like endurance training. So what does what do I think high intensity interval training, what do I think it should look like? So I think that essentially it should look like this. You get your heart rate. Go buy yourself a polar chest heart rate strap. I think the chest straps are better than, you know, your wrist straps or your Apple Watch. Go get yourself a chest strap, and you're going to perform some amount of work. You're going to perform some amount of work within that 10-second to, you know, like I said, 6-minute range, right? Ideally for me, I like to keep it between 20 seconds to 3 minutes because in 10 seconds, it's hard for me to judge how high my heart rate got. Now I can judge output, so if I'm on something like a bike, I can really judge the output. But what I really want to do is I like to set the interval up where let's just say, for example, I'm on the assault bike. I'm going to get on the assault bike and I'm going to pick an RPM level to hit that's going to be high intensity for me. So let's just throw a number out there and say I'm going to hold 80 RPMs on the assault bike. Okay. And let's say I can hold 80 RPMs on the assault bike, and I'm just going to hold 80 RPMs, and I'm going to set up my heart rate monitor, and I'm going to watch that heart rate monitor until I get to 95% heart rate. All right. As soon as I get to 95% heart rate, I'm going to stop on the bike, and then I'm going to rest and recover, and then wait for my heart rate to drop down to 65%. And then as soon as my heart rate gets to 65% and stays there at 65% for maybe 10, 20 seconds, now I'm going to get back on the bike and I'm going to do another interval. I'm going to go at 80 RPMs again. I'm going to hold 80 RPMs until my heart rate hits 95%, 97%. And then as soon as it does, I'm going to hop off the bike. And then I'm going to recover. And what I'm going to do is during those recoveries, while I'm waiting for my heart rate to drop back down to 65%, I'm going to count that time. Okay, so I'm going to see how long it takes me to recover. So then I'm going to measure my work. How long was I on the bike? How long did I hold that 80 RPMs? So let's say I held the 80 RPMs for 1 minute. And let's say my first recovery takes me exactly 3 minutes. All right, so I'm going to measure that work. I'm going to measure that recovery. Then on the next interval, I'm going to measure that work, how long it takes me to get that heart rate, and I'm going to measure that recovery. Okay. Now let's say next time, where last time it took me a minute to get to 97% heart rate or 95% heart rate, let's say this time my heart rate shoots up to 97%, but it gets there in 55 seconds. Okay. And then let's say where last round my recovery took 3 minutes. Now this time my recovery took 3 minutes and 15 seconds before I got back down to 65%. Are you tracking with me? So, and I'm going to measure that. Now, if my original recovery was 3 minutes, then once my recovery starts taking, let's say, 4 to 5 minutes, right? My recovery starts really taking quite a bit longer. Or let's say my heart rate is just, and my heart rate's just not wanting to go back down to 65%. That's when I'm going to cut myself off for the day. That's when I'm going to quit those intervals. Now, in the beginning, when you first start doing high intensity interval training and you start progressing like this, because you can use this as a progression, you might want to just start with 3 intervals. Just do 3 intervals for the day and that's it. And the next week, go to 4. The next week, go to 5. The next week, go to, you're really trying to work in that high power output range. You could set yourself up with an RPM that you are just going to, you're going to run at 30-second intervals. So you find an RPM that's going to work for you to have 30 seconds of work. Maybe you're really trying to work on that domain, like 30 seconds of work. Or maybe for you, you're trying to work on a longer domain. You're trying to work on 3 minutes. So you set your RPMs up for a higher amount. A 3-minute interval. All right, 3 minutes of work. We're going to do a 3-minute AMRAP, as many reps as possible. We're going to do 15 wall balls with a fairly light weight. For me, it would be 20-pound ball, 15 wall balls, 50 double unders with a jump rope. We're going to do 15 slam balls with a 15-pound ball, which is light for me, and then 10 burpees, which is going to really spike that heart rate towards the end of the interval. And then for the remainder of the 3 minutes, max calories on the bike. So what's going to happen is, for me, in my current condition, those movements are going to start to creep my heart rate up quickly. But I'm not going to get overuse on the legs. I'm not going to really build a ton of lactate up in the legs. It's not going to build a ton of fatigue in the upper body. But I'm going to move through those movements as fast as possible with as much intent as possible. And my heart rate is going to really get up with those movements. I know that double unders get my heart rate up. I know that wall balls, being a full body movement, get my heart rate up. Slam balls, not so bad. But I wanted to design the workout to be 3 minutes, and I didn't want anything to be super taxing on either my legs or my upper body. I didn't want to build up a ton of fatigue. So I threw in the slam balls to keep that going and to extend the interval to that 3 minute duration, because, and I'll tell you why I was wanting to go for 3 minutes. And then the burpees were going to really spike my heart rate at the end, right before I get on the bike. So as I go to the bike, my heart rate is already in that 90% zone. And I'm really only finishing out the bike in spending 30, 40 seconds on the bike. So I'm not spending a minute, 2 minutes on the bike. I'm not spending as much time on the bike. So I set that interval up for 3 minutes. Then what happened is I set my rest up for 3 minutes because I could recover pretty easily from that type of interval where I was moving from different movement to different movement to different movement. I was able to recover really well within 3 minutes and get to that 65% every single time. Now, if I would have done, let's say, a salt bike for 3 whole minutes, I don't know that I would have been able to get my heart rate back down to 65% because I would have built up so much fatigue. My legs would have just blown up. My quads would have blown up. If I'd have spent that long on the bike at the intensity I needed to get my heart rate to 95, 97%, my quads would have just blown. And that's what I didn't want. I didn't want my quads blown up. I didn't want to get that much fatigue. I potentially could have used a different exercise other than wall balls too. But I just went with wall balls. I could have gone on the rower. I could have done rowing. I could have potentially done more burpees. I could have done 20 burpees. The movement selection is totally up to you, but I wanted a 3-minute time duration. And the reason why I wanted that is because I'm training for a jiu-jitsu tournament, and in the jiu-jitsu tournament, I'm going to have 5-minute intervals. The tournament's 2 months away. I'm going to have 5-minute intervals, or I'm going to have 5-minute rounds. And so I wanted to start with this week doing a 3-minute interval, and then next time I'm going to do 3:30 or 4-minute intervals, and then the next time do 4:30 or 5-minute intervals. I want to build myself up to where I can maintain a high amount of pressure, a high pace for 6 minutes. So eventually I'm going to design the intervals to be 6 minutes long. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it's very sport specific. I want to go in with the confidence that I can hold a high, strong pace for 6 minutes straight and know that I'm not going to burn out in that 6 minutes, right? Or even though my rounds are actually going to be 5 minutes. I just want that mental confidence. And then I'll alternate. There'll be some weeks that I do go back to like a 2-minute interval and I'm doing speed work, right? Or a 3-minute interval. But that's where I think that 3-minute interval is a little bit more like speed work for me because I'm actually training for a 5-minute event, right? So it's kind of like if you're training for a 5K, sometimes you're going to do shorter intervals, right? You're going to do 1 mile intervals. So you might do 1 mile, rest, 1 mile, rest, 1 mile, rest. You might do 800 meters rest, 800 meters rest, and repeat that and accumulate up to the amount of time that you're going to do in the event. So anyways, so that's sometimes how you would structure that interval. So I wanted movements because I'm doing jiu-jitsu, because I'm doing strength training, I'm doing a power building program. I didn't want to interfere with my strength. I didn't want to interfere with my muscle endurance. I didn't want to interfere with my jiu-jitsu and my other training. So I set up for me personally the type of interval that's kind of low impact for me. It's not going to have, those movements aren't going to leave me feeling fatigued the next day. My heart rate got up through the roof. So I'm really training more of my heart rate when I'm doing that. Now, as I get a little bit closer to the competition, I'm going to cut down on some of the strength training, and those intervals will get a little bit harder where I'm building up a lot more lactate. I'm actually working on muscle endurance during the interval, things like that. So exercise selection is something that I think is super important. Time duration is something that could be important if you're training for a specific event. Now, you might not be training for a specific event. Something else that I like to do with those intervals, I like to do them ramping. I like to train myself to ramp up. I don't want to train myself to come out too hot and to fall off and to get slower as I go. I want to train myself for speed. I want to train myself to get faster. So if I'm in a jiu-jitsu competition, I want to be able to increase my pace throughout the whole match. I want to be able to keep pushing that pace harder and harder and harder through the whole match, where that other person may be getting tired. I'm able to keep pushing the pace harder and harder as I go. Same thing with CrossFit, same thing with any kind of race, a 5K, whatever. Anytime you're trying to pace for something, the ideal way is to ramp as you go. Ramp up, ramp up, ramp up. You don't go out too hot and then burn out and then slow down for the rest of the race. So I do the same thing with my intervals. So I'm doing 4 intervals. Interval 1 is going to be really hard. I'm still going to get to that 95% heart rate, but I'm going to know that I could go a little bit faster. The second interval is going to be a little bit faster. Third interval, a little bit faster. Or if I know that I'm doing 4 intervals that day, My third is going to be pretty dang close to full effort. And then my fourth is going to be all out. I'm going to ramp those up as I go. And that's going to give me an idea of where I'm at for the next following weeks as well. So if I'm repeating that same type of interval with the same exercises, but I'm just adding to it, now next week I've got that record and I know my intervals, I know my times, I know my splits. I know what I need to hit on those splits every single time. So next week I might try to beat that first interval from this week. I might try to beat it by a little bit. I might try to beat the second one by a little bit, beat the third one by a little bit, and then maybe fourth one tie it, and then fifth one try to come out and maybe tie it again or even beat it, and just keep ramping through those as I go. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. So that's what HIIT training is to me. Essentially, it's building the heart rate up to 95 to 97%, getting a full recovery back down to 65% heart rate, and then repeat again. Not spending a ton of time in that 95+% heart rate zone. You don't have to spend tons of time there. Notice in my intervals, most of the time I'm trying to cut myself off almost right when I get to that and then stop. Maybe you want to work for 20, 30 seconds in that zone, but that's it. And then I'm going to do that type of training, honestly, for me, about once per week, once per 7-day period. So I'm not really looking to do that type of training too much at this point. If I'm doing strength training, if I'm doing long aerobic base training, if I'm doing jiu-jitsu multiple times a week as well, there's not a lot of room for me to be able to do that high intensity interval training and still recover. We got to remember that that type of training is super taxing on the body, and we have to be careful about how much we dose it and how much we use that type of training, because it can be overused and it can lead to a lot of fatigue, and it can lead to losing some of your gains in some other areas. If you're training for a sport that takes a lot of mental willpower like jiu-jitsu and a lot of concentration, you may be so fatigued that you just can't pay attention and it's hard for you to focus and hard for you to learn. Or you're just so tired that you really just can't perform and do jiu-jitsu, and that's not good. Or if you're trying to get stronger, you're so fatigued from the high intensity interval training that you cannot get stronger, which is a problem if you're trying to gain strength. Now, if your whole goal is to increase VO2 max, and that is your number one goal is to increase that high intensity zone, then yes, you could set up all your other training in a way that you could probably do high intensity interval training 3 times a week, and you would lower your volume and lower your intensity on all the other stuff in order to make sure that you can maximize the HIIT training and still recover for everything else that you're doing. So it's all about priorities, right? So then, of course, you can do high intensity interval training measuring it with other means other than heart rate. You can do FTP. So you can find your functional threshold power. You can look up ways how to find that. You could find it on the assault bike. You could find it on the rower. You could find it on something like that. But you're going to have something that measures your wattage. And basically, you're going to find your different FTP zones, and you're going to want to train in them higher FTP zones. And you can go online and look up all kinds of protocols and ways you can train in those high zones for high intensity training. Which is super cool. I do train FTP sometimes as well. I like to cycle on the Peloton bike, and I use FTP on it, and they have great FTP training, power zone training, which is awesome. They set up all kinds of awesome training for you. So you can do power zone max rides and really work in those high zones. But I like having either that FTP or that heart rate to be able to actually have a real handle on what I'm doing, because if not, it could be easy to, if you're a real type A person, you could just go too hard and stay in them hard zones for too long and really hurt your recovery and potentially hurt your performance. And if you're somebody who is not super strong mentally, you could do the opposite and you're not really training hard enough and you think you are. So I think it's good to have either that FTP or that heart rate monitor to really show you where you're at, because there's kind of both sides of the train tracks, and I think that keeping some kind of data in front of us helps keep us, whichever side we're on, it helps keep us kind of dialed in where we need to be. So yeah, that's kind of, I think that's everything that I really want to talk about with HIIT training for now. If you have any questions or comments about HIIT training, please hit me up in the comments. I would love to hear your questions or your experiences with HIIT training, how you do your HIIT training, all that. Super excited about it. If you have any cool workouts, cool HIIT training workouts that you've done, things that you like, please throw those down there in the comments. Would love to see them, love to hear about them, hear about what you're doing. Any questions about training in general, comments about training in general, controversy, things that you disagree with that I said, whatever, throw them down there in the comments. I'd like to make some videos to address and talk about those as well. Thank you again for watching.